Hello everyone and welcome back to another book review. Today I am going to be reviewing Faces of Power and Piety by Erik Inglis. This is a book in the Medieval Imagination series and is just under 200 pages. So if you've been following my book reviews for a while, I have been reviewing a number of books that discuss how monsters were portrayed or discussed in medieval art and literature, as well as margin illustrations in medieval literature. So I felt like this book would be a natural next step in my reading journey. It was also under 100 pages, so not too long, and would give me plenty of time to absorb the material and decide if I wanted to read further. So I really enjoy reading about medieval art and what we can learn from it about that time. The Medieval Imagination series, I have read one other book in this series, does a really good job of introducing concepts in medieval art to the reader, and this book is no exception. In just under 100 pages, they introduce three different topics. They introduce likeness and identity in medieval portraits. They talk about past portraits, and then they talk about present. So there's three different sections that they are going through. So I'm going to go through each of these sections and then discuss my thoughts on this feelings as well on this book, as well as my feelings on this book and connections I have made with other art having read this book. So the time frame that Faces of Power and Piety covers is around 700 to 1600 AD, so quite a long time frame. And I think I wanted to start with a section on page 7 in this book because the idea of what a portrait is in the Middle Ages or in medieval times is very different from what we might consider a portrait or a picture of someone today. And usually when we look at these older portraits, we may think that they aren't very realistic or they don't have a good depiction of what that person actually looked like. And that differs from how we view portraits today. And there was a paragraph on page 7 in this book that just describes this situation much better than I could ever paraphrase. So I'm just going to directly quote and read from this paragraph to explain this problem. And that is the subject of the first section of this book, the likeness and identity. This is the first full paragraph on page 7 if you are following along or want to find the exact quote that I've used. Modern viewers who are used to realistic, individualized portraits may be forgiven for feeling that such medieval paintings do not constitute true portraits. And this is something we see in a lot of these medieval pictures. You start seeing everyone's faces look the same, and you wonder how you can tell people apart. From the medieval point of view, however, these portraits are every bit as concerned with recognizability and character as modern examples. Viewers simply understood these terms very differently. Contemporary portraits start with a realistic likeness and hope for something of the person's identity, while medieval portraits started with the person's identity and left out distracting and unnecessary elements such as physical appearance. Identification was assured in other ways, for a portrait can be recognizable without being realistic. Many subjects are identified by their attributes, objects associated with them. Attire is the most important. Armor indicates a knight, a hooded robe for a monk, a fine gown for a noble lady. And they go on, and I'm going to get more into that in the past section. But when we look at these portraits, particularly I think from the earlier Middle Ages, we see that they aren't very good, faithful renderings of how someone actually looked. But they do contain an important element of the identity of the person, and that is what was most important to the viewers. They wanted to know who that person was, and they could tell who that person was not by their physical likeness, but by their identity and objects associated with them. Also, an idea discussed in this beginning is instead of the image being realistic and hopefully also capturing identity, the portraits in the Middle Ages, especially the early Middle Ages, could be aspirational. You wanted to be like the person you were in your portrait. You wanted to be as pious as you were displayed in the portraits, for example. So I think that the idea of identity being central instead of physical, realistic depictions of someone being center is a big difference in medieval art. However, as this time frame moves from the 700s to the 1600s, so into the Renaissance, the realisticness of the portraits increases, so the portraits are getting more realistic and more faithfully render how people actually physically looked. And this is something that we do see. So I'm going to move into the second section now, which is portraits of the past. So a big problem when it came to depicting portraits of the past, and a large focus of this book, and maybe you can tell by Power and Piety, is on religious portraiture or pictures of religious significance, was how would you depict someone with no eyewitness accounts? And the medieval artists solved this problem by a number of ways. The first one I have already mentioned, and that is having symbols or items assigned to someone that will let the reader or the viewer know who that person is. There's a picture in here about a list of female saints, and if you look at the actual likeness of the female saints, they all sort of look the same, but each female saint has an item with them. Here it is, that identifies them as being who they are. Sometimes these saints are depicted with the item that they were killed by, or their implement of death, or how they were tortured, because that is what's recognizable. Other of them have like this one, I think it's Agnes, has a lamb. So there's different ways to identify these women, even though their faces all look similar. So that is one way that the artist would depict these people and let you know who you are. But this worked a lot for saints and people of the past, but it didn't work for everybody, and sometimes the artist had trouble depicting things that were more conceptual. For example, God or the Trinity. There is a funny story about one of the some of the artists deciding to depict the Trinity as one person with 3 heads, and the Catholic Church put an end to that really quickly. They decided that was too monstrous, but it does raise interesting questions on what attributes you can give to something so that you know who these people are. A very interesting story that I heard in here is that I had never heard of before, is the role that Byzantine icons played in determining how these different religious figures would be depicted. And around a lot of these religious figures, traditions would grow up, so they would start to be depicted in one way and artists would continue to depict that one way. And I think that also makes it easy for a viewer to know what they're looking at. If, for example, the Virgin Mary is always depicted in one way, it's easy to pick her out. But Byzantine icons, according to this book, began flowing in, and the medieval, I'm assuming Western medieval artists began to assume that those were old eyewitness or maybe more accurate depictions of the view. So these Byzantine icons became a basis for which people were depicted. I believe the example given was the Virgin Mary always having like a blue hood on, and I guess because that was shown in the Byzantine icons and to the medieval artists' the icons looked much older and much more accurate. They decided, or accurate in the fact that it's older, and they decided to start following that as their way of drawing. That was just an interesting side note that I thought was, interesting. Next, so we have these historical portraits of very important figures from the past, namely saints, but also Jesus, God, and how we were depicting those. And those make sense because there's no eyewitness accounts. But then there's a whole section of the third section of the book, which is concerned with present portraits. So how a present person could be depicted. And one of the methods that they used was historiated portraits, in which a present person would be in a past event. And this usually had religious significance, or at least I assumed it had religious significance for most of these people. We have, for example, an individual here. We have the modern individual, or the present person, being depicted with Paul's conversion to Christianity, which is an act that is depicted, or a story that is depicted in the Bible. So we have a present or a contemporary person being depicted with a historical event that occurred in the Bible. So you're putting yourself with that person. So that could be a way of either showing devotion or putting yourself in these historical events. This is one where a woman and a daughter are present at the crucifixion. We have another one where a woman is placed instead of Elizabeth in the visitation, in which Mary visits her sister or sister-in-law Elizabeth. So we have many examples of this, but this extends beyond religious pictures. There are a number of examples of people who gifted books, having themselves depicted giving the book to the person they're giving it to. So if you're going to give a book to a queen, you might depict yourself giving the queen the book, so that every time she reads the book, she remembers who gave it to her and remembers your generosity. And that was a way that you could kind of remind the person of who you were and your generosity. I can't come up with I didn't write a page number down for this example, I'm so sorry, but that is depicted in this book as well. And also as we got closer through these present pictures, there became a more faithful rendering of how people presently looked, how people actually looked at their likeness, as opposed to the way that it was in the earlier Middle Ages or before the Renaissance, where the focus was more on your identity coming through and less about the physical likeness. Something that also was interesting to me as I read this book, and I have two specific examples, is that these pictures were not just static, but the readers actually had an emotional response to these pictures or to these portraits. The two examples I wanted to include, the first one is on page 29. This is a saint who has had her halo cut out. So someone apparently disagreed with her sainthood and decided to cut her halo out. So these are not just pictures that exist in a vacuum, but people are actually interacting with these pictures and these portraits and have feelings about them. The other example I wanted to show was on page 52, Fortune. So she is frequently depicted with a wheel as bringing the high low, and I guess probably the low high. Someone decided that she was maybe inauspicious, I don't know if I'm saying that word correctly, but has rubbed her face out because they didn't want to be associated with her, or they thought her to be kind of dangerous. It says here, to us, Fortune may appear comical rather than terrifying, but one of the book's previous owners took her threat so seriously that he rubbed out her face as if to render her powerless. And I think that this one is important because it's not necessarily her looks that render her important. So we know it's Fortune not because of her physical likeness, but because we see physical likeness as in her face, but she has many arms, which is one way that Fortune is depicted, along with being depicted with her wheel. So the reader knew who that was and knew the connotations around Fortune, and then took it upon himself or herself to rub out Fortune's face. So despite the size of this book and being under 100 pages, I would still recommend taking 1 to 2 hours to work through this book. I think there's a lot to see in here. With medieval art, I find it's very detailed, and the longer I look at it, the more I get out of it. So I would really recommend taking your time to look through each of these pieces. Also, I would recommend not just looking at the subject in question, so the subject being talked about, but also look at all of these borders. I have read many books on these borders, these edges, these margins in medieval text, and many of the interesting things that they contain. So I've been able to carry over a lot of my reading on those borders from other books and bring them into this book and look at a lot more of these edges and borders and margins when I am reading this, which made it a very interesting book. And I, again, think that you can't spend too much time with pictures like this because there's a lot to see within this. Now, one interesting crossover that I found, and this is going to be my last point, between this, which is medieval, primarily Western Europe, is a connection to Japanese art. And there's two specific instances where looking at this book reminded me of other books that I have read focusing on the Japanese wood block print traditions, and I have a bunch of reviews of those on my channel. So there's two that I wanted to point out. The first is on page 81. And I think this is something that happens when you read nonfiction. The more nonfiction you read, the more you learn about, the more you're able to see connections where maybe it wouldn't be an obvious connection, or maybe there isn't a true connection, because I'm sure medieval Western Europe didn't have much to do with Japan and the printmaking tradition in the 1800s, but there can be subject connections which are maybe easier to see, or you see more frequently once you have read a lot of nonfiction. Page 81 is where I'm going with this. Maybe I should work to get there. And it's page 81 discusses it in the epilogue, but I'm actually going to show page 82 and 83. And this is a death sequence, and it's kind of reminding everyone that they are going to die. It's part of this Book of Hours, I believe. And it has the prayers in the Office of the Dead, so people who have this book would be able to follow along. But there's these skeletons that jump out, which reminded me of a particular Japanese artist. I think it's pronounced Kawanabe Kyosai. And Kyosai has these distinctive skeletons in a lot of his work. And it just reminded me, even though I'm sure that Kyosai had no connection with the artists here who had done these skeletons, I did see that common connection between those two. Now, a stronger connection, I think, can be found on page 84, and again, not a true connection, and these artists had anything to do with each other or there was inspiration, but I think the inspiration comes from the common human experience, and that is the mirror of conscience And that is in this book, page 84, where you look into a mirror and you see a skeleton. It is, I believe, a memento mori. It's to, I hope I'm saying that correctly, it's to remind the viewer that you will die and that you are mortal and you will again face death at some point in your life. It is the natural end of life. And this strongly reminded me of an piece of art by Yoshitoshi. I hope I'm saying his name correctly too. And it depicts a very beautiful courtesan, and she's sitting in front of a mirror and she's looking in and she's seeing a skeleton look back at her. And that feels very reminiscent of the fact that this beautiful courtesan who is in the prime of her beauty is going to look into that mirror and she too will die. She's recognizing her own immortality. It's like the courtesan, and then it has her name. Looks into the mirror of hell, I believe is the title of that piece of work. But this page reminded me strongly of that piece of work of the Japanese print tradition. Overall, I highly recommend Faces of Power and Piety. I know there's probably an abrupt transition from dead faces and mirrors to great book, but it is a great book and I really did enjoy it. I'm really enjoying this Medieval Imagination series. I haven't really read them continuously or like one right after the other, but I have read other books in the Medieval Imagination series, and I love reading more about this. I think that if you are interested in medieval art, this would be a great book to check out, and if there's anything in here that seems interesting, I'm sure you can take your interest and dive deeper with more books to read and to go into more detailed text if that is what interests you. If you have any thoughts, comments on this book, or if you have any books you would like to recommend, please leave it in the comment section down below. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.